A fog settles heavy over odd, West Virginia, the kind that doesn't drift so much as linger like it remembers. The hills stand still under the pale wash of dawn, their shapes swallowed in grey. A rusted mailbox leans by the road, its flag long broken, its paint chipped away by years of silence. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then nothing. Only the hum of insects and the low, steady sigh of wind through empty trees. By the late 1970s, America had already moved on disco on the radio, highways slicing through mountains, cities glowing brighter than ever before. But deep in the folds of Appalachia, there were still hollows where time stood still, and families who lived far from its reach. The camera glides down a dirt road carved by truck tires and rain toward a cluster of weathered trailers. The Whittaker home, small, tired, but still standing, sits at the heart of it all. The walls have seen decades. The soil beneath has held generations. It's here the Whittakers lived, a name whispered more than spoken, a family tied not by choice, but by blood, bound to the hills that gave them life and the world that refused to understand them. Archival footage flickers across the screen, the old Whittaker interviews, the ones that made the family infamous, faces framed by poverty and pride, voices fractured by isolation. We hear echoes of those earlier days. Ray's quiet stare, Betty's soft words, the dogs barking in the background. Now, we return to the present. The next generation stands where the old one once did. Timmy, born around 1979, and Jason, around 1978. The world they inherited wasn't wealth or comfort. It was memory, the kind that clings like smoke. They were born after the world had already judged their name. Children in a hollow that history forgot, raised in the shadow of stories they never told. The tone deepens, the sense of a legacy, repeating itself, of silence becoming inheritance. And maybe that's the tragedy of the Whittakers, that some bloodlines don't just fade away. They echo. A low Appalachian hymn hums beneath the closing narration. The frame pulls back, a single light glowing in the hollow's darkness. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere quiet, I hope. Subscribe if you believe every forgotten family deserves to have their story remembered, no matter how dark. A thin morning light slips through a curtain made from an old bedsheet. Inside a small cinder-block home, the air is heavy, thick with the scent of old wood, kerosene, and thyme. The walls bear stains of winters long survived. On the porch, dogs stir, their low growls the only sound breaking the stillness. They were born into a quiet that most would call peace, but in the Appalachian hollows, quiet often hides history. Timmy Whittaker, born around 1979, and Jason Whittaker, a year before him, two boys from the last branch of a name already sinking into myth. They didn't ask to inherit the past, but in odd, West Virginia, blood remembers. Every generation carries what the last one couldn't bury. Their home was small, one story. No toys scattered across the floor, no hum of television laughter. Just the creak of floorboards beneath bare feet and the distant barking of hounds that never stopped. The camera lingers on details, a pair of muddy shoes by the door, a family photo with faces turned slightly away from the lens, a single oil lamp flickering against the paneled wall. Outside, the hills loom, vast and watchful, as if the mountains themselves were keeping the family's secrets. Timmy was the quiet one. He had soft eyes, the kind that watched more than they spoke. There was something heavy in that gaze, even as a child, as though he already knew the weight of his name. Jason was different, restless, always moving, always searching. He'd wander the yard for hours, pacing the same worn path through the weeds, as if chasing something the world had taken from him. Neighbors remembered them as polite but distant, two boys who stayed close to home, rarely seen beyond the tree line. In a town that whispers, the Whittaker children were the silence itself. The voice lowers, almost mournful. They were born at the edge of a story between the old ways that refused to die and a modern world that had no place for them, and in that space, innocence became inheritance. The scene fades to black. The faint echo of dogs barking carried on the wind. The name Whittaker carried further than any of them ever did. It rolled down the hollows and over state lines, whispered in truck stops, muttered in diners, passed along by strangers who'd never seen the place for themselves. To outsiders, the name meant inbreeding, mystery, oddity. But here, in odd, West Virginia, it meant something different. It meant survival. By the time Timmy and Jason were old enough to know their names, the world had already written their story for them. The scene opens on an old dirt road leading to the Whittaker home. The camera follows a pair of muddy footprints fading into the gravel. The sound of wind slips between the trees, carrying faint echoes of laughter or maybe whispers. The kind of whispers that never stop once they start. Inside, the boys move through their small world, cautious, observant. They hear things, feel them. The way people look too long, the way pity replaces kindness, the way the mailman doesn't come up the drive anymore. In these parts, shame travels faster than light. You don't need to do wrong, you just need to belong to the wrong name. Archival clips flicker briefly the earlier Whittaker family videos now infamous online. A reminder that what was once private became public spectacle. Strangers watched from across the globe, dissecting gestures, voices, faces, never realizing they were watching the residue of generations of isolation and trauma. For Timmy and Jason, childhood wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. Every stare from a stranger pressed another stone onto their backs. Every camera that arrived stole another piece of their peace. They didn't know the full history, the stories of abuse, poverty, and intermarriage, but they felt it in every silence that hung in the air. The burden of a name isn't always about what you've done. Sometimes it's about what the world decides you are. We see them sitting on the porch, Jason restless, Timmy still. Behind them, the hills stretch endlessly, both shelter and cage. To outsiders, the Whittakers were curiosity. To themselves, they were kin, the last roots of a bloodline planted too deep to ever pull free. The sound fades to crickets and distant thunder. The voice returns softer now, almost like a confession. Night settles over Raleigh County, slow and deliberate. The crickets hum a tired hymn, and the trees stand like silhouettes against a bruised sky. Somewhere down an unmarked road, the Whittaker home sits in shadow, its roof sagging, its windows flickering with the weak light of an oil lamp. The walls breathe memory, and the ground beneath them remembers every generation that's come and gone. The Whittakers weren't monsters. They were history's forgotten experiment in isolation, the price of poverty and pride. Before Timmy and Jason were born, there was Larry, Ray, and Lorene, names that once meant nothing beyond the hollow. Now, they stand as the haunting symbols of what happens when a family becomes its own world. Each one carried pieces of a long Appalachian story, one written not in ink, but in silence, abuse, and survival. These hills didn't just raise families, they kept them. Fences weren't built from wood here, they were built from shame. The Whittakers' lineage stretches back through generations of cousins and kin living side by side, too poor to leave, too proud to ask for help. What began as survival hardened into isolation. Over time, the bloodline looped back on itself, generation after generation, until the family tree became a circle. Archival images fade in old black and white footage of the original family members, their faces marked by hardship and confusion. The eyes of Ray Whittaker stare blankly into the camera, his silence saying more than any words could. Larry, shuffling in the background, muttering softly to himself. Lorene, watching from the porch, half smiling at strangers who never understood her world. What outsiders saw as madness was often the echo of generations, the inherited confusion of inbreeding, untreated illness, and endless poverty. It wasn't evil. It was endurance. The narration slows, lowering to almost a whisper. And when Timmy and Jason came into that same hollow, they didn't just inherit a name, they inherited memory. Every stare, every whisper, every shadow in the family's history became their birthright. The hills fall silent again. A lone dog barks in the distance, and the sound of wind brushing against tin roof carries through the night. Blood remembers, even when people forget. And in places like West Virginia, blood never forgets. The camera pans slowly from the dimly lit trailer to the vast darkness of the forest beyond, endless, unbroken, and old as sin. Morning mist clings to the hollow like a veil, thin, trembling, and heavy with what's coming. The hills of West Virginia sit in uneasy quiet, the same quiet that has always guarded the Whittakers. But in the early 2000s, that silence began to crack. Not from thunder or gunfire, but from the faint buzz of a camera lens finding its focus. What began as curiosity became consumption. For generations, The Whittakers lived unseen, their world tucked away behind rusted mailboxes and gravel roads. But when the first outsiders came, armed with cameras and questions, that privacy was gone. The boys Timmy and Jason were still young then. They didn't understand what it meant to have a lens pointed at them, to have their faces captured not as people, but as proof. Their innocence became content, their silence became spectacle. Archival footage flickers across the screen, the original Whittaker videos that once shocked the world. Viewers remember the barking dogs, the mumbling voices, the camera slowly panning across a porch where confusion met intrusion. But what most never saw were the eyes of the younger Whittakers, wide, unblinking, uncertain, watching strangers turn their home into a stage. Inside that hollow, there was no script, no defense, only family trying to endure another kind of hunger, the hunger of a world that feeds on the lives of others. In Appalachia, survival had always meant keeping your head down, but now, even silence couldn't save them. The footage that spread across the internet was supposed to be a documentary, a glimpse into poverty and isolation. But as it went viral, something darker happened. The story became a meme. Their faces became thumbnails. And the name Whittaker, already burdened by stigma, became entertainment. The camera lingers on Timmy's expression, calm, wary, almost pleading, and then on Jason's distant stare, as if he's looking for a world that isn't watching him back. They never asked for fame. They never understood it. And yet, millions watched, judged, laughed. Silence falls again. Deeper this time, the silence that comes after a story has been taken and sold. Subscribe if you believe stories like this deserve to be told with respect, not for clicks, but for truth. The hollow wakes slow beneath a dim, colorless dawn. Mist curls along the gravel road, swallowing the path ahead until it disappears into nothing. In that grey stillness, a figure moves slow, deliberate, barefoot through the morning dew. Jason Whittaker. He was always walking. No map, no reason, just the need to move. Locals in Raleigh County would spot him, sometimes drifting between the ridges and the backroads, his hands tucked into the pockets of an old jacket, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the horizon. Some waved, most didn't. They say he'd mutter softly as he walked, half to himself, half to ghosts no one else could hear. He'd vanish for days at a time, then return, quiet as a shadow. Like the hills themselves had borrowed him a while. The camera glides over long stretches of road, cracked and glistening from last night's rain. A plastic bottle lies crushed near the ditch. An old fence leans toward the field, its wire rusted thin. Somewhere in the distance, a train moans through the valley, a sound both lonely and ancient. Jason walks through it all like he belongs to none of it, yet it all belongs to him. Some said he was escaping. Others believed he was returning, walking the same paths his ancestors once took, as if tracing the loops of the family's bloodline through the hills. His wandering became legend in odd, West Virginia, a quiet folklore whispered among neighbors. They'd see him at dusk, crossing Route 3, barefoot, shoulders hunched against the wind. No destination, no explanation, just motion, constant, haunted, human. For Jason, walking wasn't running away. It was remembering. Every step carried the echo of generations before him, the pain, the isolation, the confusion that came from being born into a world that never let him belong. Some men wander to see what's out there, others wander to escape what's inside. Jason did both. The scene fades to a single shot. Jason's figure shrinking against the Appalachian hills, the light behind him fading into the dark. The sound of his footsteps fades too, replaced by the soft whisper of wind through the trees. Maybe he wasn't lost. Maybe he was just walking toward the only place that ever made sense, the silence. The morning light filters weakly through the trees, falling in pale streaks across an old wooden porch. The boards creak under the weight of years, and somewhere, a hound stirs, the kind of dog that knows every sound the hollow makes. Timmy Whittaker sits there, motionless, the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. In his silence, the world hums on. Crickets, wind, and the faint echo of a past that never truly left. He stayed near the old home, tending to what the world had left behind. For those who pass through odd, West Virginia, Timmy is a familiar shape on that sagging porch, a man who nods when waved to, but rarely speaks. His quiet is not shyness. It's the kind of silence that comes from watching too much crumble and knowing no words could fix it. The camera lingers on the peeling paint of the family house, the same place where generations of Whittakers lived, loved, and unraveled. The dogs circle near his feet, lean and loyal, their presence both company and memory. He feeds them without a word, each motion careful, as if afraid to break the fragile stillness of the morning. They say Timmy never left, that he couldn't, that the roots ran too deep, tangled in the soil, in the name, in the blood. When strangers come by, tourists mostly, curious about the stories that turned his family into an internet spectacle, Timmy does what he's always done, nods politely, looks away, and lets the silence answer for him. He's become the final chapter of a story no one meant to tell, the living echo of a bloodline that refused to vanish, even after the world turned its eyes elsewhere. There's something sacred in his staying, not stubbornness, but duty. The hills raised him, kept him, and now he returns the favor by keeping what little remains upright. The house, the dogs, the memory, all of it rests in his quiet hands. In a world that left them behind, Timmy remained, the last keeper of a hollow, haunted by love, loss, and legacy. As the frame darkens, we hear the soft rustle of wind through the pines, a sound older than any name whispered here. A truck hums down the narrow road into odd West Virginia, its tires spitting gravel across the dirt path that leads to the Whittaker home. The holler is quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't welcome strangers. Yet one day, years ago, that silence was broken, not by kin, not by neighbors, but by outsiders carrying cameras. To the lens, they were content. But behind the lens, there were questions no one dared to ask. The first photographs were simple faces framed by the Appalachian woods, dogs barking in the background, and an uneasy stillness between each breath. What began as curiosity quickly turned into a global fascination. The Whittakers became subjects not of empathy, but of exposure. Their poverty, their isolation, their lineage, all turned into content for a world hungry for something real. The internet lit up. Millions clicked. Some pitied, others mocked. Few understood. Each thumbnail, each title, carried the same undertone, a blend of fascination and unease, of pity disguised as compassion. For the Whittakers, there was no script, no defense, no understanding of what it meant to be broadcast to the world. When the lens left, the hills went back to silence. But silence never forgets. Timmy stayed on the porch, the dogs at his feet. Jason drifted. The camera crews moved on to the next story, but the echoes remained in every repost, every headline, every whispered name, spoken without context. What outsiders called documentation, the mountains remembered as intrusion. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not just the family's pain, but how the world consumed it, turning generational trauma into digital folklore, stripping away the humanity in exchange for views, for shock, for curiosity. In a way, we all looked through that same lens, searching for truth, but finding our reflection in their ruin. The question that lingers is one without an answer. Where does empathy end and exploitation begin? The story of the Whittakers isn't just theirs anymore, it's ours too. A mirror held up to a society that confuses watching with understanding. The wind rises again, brushing through the pines as if the hollow itself sighs. The camera fades to black, leaving only the echo of that uneasy silence. A pale orange dusk bleeds over Raleigh County, the kind that lingers just long enough to make everything feel suspended, not living, not dead, but caught between the two. The hills are still, save for the low hum of cicadas and the distant creak of a porch swing. In the hollow below, a single light flickers in the window of a weathered trailer. It's small, dim, yet somehow defiant, the last light of the Whittaker name. No confirmed children, no known future generations. When the last of a name fades, what remains the people, or their myth? Timmy still sits on that same porch some evenings, dogs at his side, the sky folding into darkness. Jason, they say, wanders less now, or maybe he just wandered far enough to disappear into the folds of memory. Together, they are what's left, the human remnants of a story that began generations ago, when the mountains were young and families rarely left the hollows they were born in. But names, like echoes, have their own kind of half-life. The Whittakers no longer stand as a family so much as they do a symbol of isolation, of poverty, of misunderstanding. To outsiders, they've become legend. To those who know the land, they are a quiet scar, proof of what happens when time forgets a people but remembers their shadow. The air feels heavy here, like history pressing down on the soil. You can almost hear it if you listen close, the murmur of names half swallowed by dirt, the clatter of an old tin roof in the wind, the rhythm of something ancient refusing to die completely. Somewhere in the woods, the remains of their homestead still stand, a crooked mailbox, a sagging fence, the ghosts of laughter that once filled these hollows before shame replaced it. When the light goes out, the story doesn't end. It lingers in whispers, in footage, in the eyes of those who still remember. The Whittaker story isn't just about a bloodline. It's about how the world chose to see it, about how myth can outlive man. The final generation, Timmy and Jason, carry not just their name, but the weight of its meaning, a burden carved deep into the Appalachian hills themselves. As the last glow from the trailer window fades into night, we're left wondering what truly survives: blood, memory, or the stories we tell to keep them alive. Night settles over odd West Virginia, in that patient way it always does, not sudden, not loud, but slow and certain. The fog drifts through the hollow like a ghost returning home. Crickets hum their endless hymn, and the old Whittaker place sits beneath the trees, silent but not empty. There's still something there, a presence that time couldn't quite erase. Maybe the story of the Whittakers isn't about inbreeding or poverty. Maybe it's about what happens when the world forgets its own people. For generations, their name echoed through these hills, passed from one weathered porch to another. The world saw them as spectacle, an oddity to be studied, a whisper to be replayed. But here, in the quiet of the Appalachian night, they were simply people bound by blood, shaped by hardship, and swallowed by isolation. They laughed once, they fought, they endured. Now, the hollow remembers them in its own way. In the bark of old trees where names were carved, in the faint sound of dogs that still roam near the rusted mailbox, in the faint glimmer of light that sometimes flickers from the trailer window long after the world has turned its eyes away. The Whittaker story is not a headline, it's a wound that speaks softly. It's the ache of forgotten history, the shadow of generational trauma left to echo in a place too proud to leave and too poor to change. Their silence was never emptiness. It was grief in its purest form, a language the hills themselves seem to understand. Every family leaves a mark. Some are written in ink, others in silence. The camera pans upward across the trees, the dirt road, the stars dimmed by mist. The hollow exhales one last breath, and the night holds it still. This is not an ending, only a remembering. Because even when the world forgets, the mountains keep their ghosts. Where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere quiet, I hope. Subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline if you believe some stories deserve to be remembered no matter how dark.